Welcome, everyone. Really excited to be here tonight. This is the series on women, sponsored by the Church in the 21st Century Center and the Boston College Women's Resource Center. The name of tonight's program is Women for Others, Leaders for Our Church, with Pat DeLu, Paula Eben, Nancy Pineda-Madrid, and Liz Fennell. And my name is Karen Kiefer. I know several of you in the room. I am the Associate Director of the Church in the 21st Century Center, happily. And I've worked closely with my colleague, Katie Dalton, who actually is the Director of the Women's Resource Center here at Boston College. Katie couldn't make it tonight. She has a really good excuse. She just delivered her first baby. Yes, a beautiful baby boy, Liam, 10 days early. And I remember saying, don't worry, Katie, the first baby comes late, don't worry. But anyway, Liam would not be denied. So Katie is with us in spirit, and we thank her for all of her help in putting this event together. As many of you probably know, the Church in the 21st Century Center serves as a catalyst and a resource for the renewal of the church. And one of the ways that we do that is put together programming. And we had a magnificent conference back in 2004. The name of the conference was Envisioning the Church Women Want. Out of that conference came this programming, the series on women. And a group of women got together and they put together a mission statement for this program. And I just want to read it to you because I think it's important to revisit it. Sometimes we have to go back to move forward. The C21 series on women provides a public forum for members of the Boston College community to learn more about the history of women in the Catholic Church, to share women's stories of the integration of their faith with the fullness of their lives, and to cultivate mentoring relationships among women of faith affiliated with Boston College. When we put together tonight's event, what we wanted was a discussion, a conversation about women that don't necessarily work for the church, like our beloved women religious, but women who are living their lives and actually living their faith through their careers or through their passions or through their talents. And we just wanted to kind of take a look at what that looks like and reaffirm that. I have the great pleasure of introducing Pat DeLu, who is, I said, the Oprah of the evening. For those of you that know Pat DeLu, and for those of you that don't, I could probably spend the next day just going through her vitae, but I won't. I will tell you, as a woman on the Boston College campus, and as actually a professional on the Boston College campus, she's one of the most respected individuals on campus. She's one of the highest ranking women. She's a scholar, and she's also vice provost for faculties. And what that basically means is that Pat works hard to facilitate and get the best faculty here at Boston College and to keep them here. And our college is such a great college because of the great faculty, and Pat has been so much a part of that. She knows a lot about so many things. She can talk to you about medieval religious art, and then switch to the history of Christianity, and then talk politics, and then to gardening. She's also a mother of two terrific kids, and she has been so passionately and fully engaged in the Sacred Heart Parish in Lexington for so many years. But that's Pat. I mean, she's just always engaged, and she's the best person to have a conversation with. So without further ado, I turn it over to Pat DeLu. Oh, it rhymes.
Thank you, Karen. I get this long resume because I've lived a long life. Well, as Karen said, welcome to a conversation about faith and the vocation to serve others with women who make significant contributions to the church, which we understand to be the people of God, in their lives and in their work, as do, I'm sure, and I hope to have, in fact, a conversation with all of you this afternoon, as do many of you. Let me begin by introducing my conversation partners. To my left, Paula Eben is a Boston College alumna and an award-winning journalist and anchor for WBZ TV News. In addition to her career and significant work with Boston area charities and nonprofits, including, I am happy to say, Boston College. Paula is the mother of 4 children. In the middle, yay, Paula. Nancy Pineda Madrid is Associate Professor of Theology and Latino and Latina Ministry in Boston College's School of Theology and Ministry. Nancy holds a PhD in Systematic and Philosophical Theology from the Graduate Theological Union and an MDiv from Seattle University. Nancy teaches and writes about many areas of theology, including and especially those of U.S. Latino-Latina experiences and feminist theology. Nancy is the mother of 2. Thank you. and the author of this book. Elizabeth Stowe Fennell graduated from Boston College in 2005 with a degree in psychology and theology. She earned a master's degree in the University of Notre Dame's Alliance for Catholic Education. Liz is the chair of the Boston Advocates for Catholic Education, a member of the Catholic Schools Foundation's Allocations Committee, a member of Boston College's Spiritual Life Committee, and a lector at St. Bridget Parish in South Boston. Liz is the mother of 1.5. Well, our format this afternoon will be conversation. I have some questions I'd like the panelists to consider and speak about individually, and then perhaps in conversation among themselves. Then we'll turn it open and invite you all to speak about your own or others' experiences of faith and life so that we can all learn from one another this afternoon. So let me start by asking a question. As adults, we recognize that our experience of our faith changes as we change. Can you talk about what the faith of your childhood was like, and what of it, if anything, remains with you? Are there women in that past, saints perhaps, whose stories you still remember, from whom you gain strength or perspective? Paula?
I was thinking about this question because we did get a little preview.
They got the questions ahead of time, truth be told.
And one of the interesting things, I'm the youngest of 11 children, big Irish Catholic family. My father was Boston College class of 1943. And so I was a late in life baby, which is interesting to begin with because a lot of my peers' parents were early baby boomers. My parents were not children of the Depression, but teenagers of the Depression. So I was brought up in a household with clearly very pre-Vatican II parents, even though I was a child of the 1970s. I was in grammar school in the 1970s and high school and college in the 1980s. So it was interesting for me. I had all of these older siblings who were educated with the Baltimore Catechism, which was always kicking around the house. They had nuns in full black habit. We were all educated by the Sisters of Notre Dame. I know there are some Sisters of St. Joseph here, and they said they'll do. And so it was kind of interesting for me that I had this very hybrid childhood in the Catholic Church. At home, my parents were extremely devout, pre-Vatican II Catholics, but then as I went to our parish school, the habits came off, the sort of guitar mass Catholicism sort of took over. I had no white veil and dress at my first communion. It was very casual. All of that was thrown out.
Yeah.
And I would have to say, for my parish, I think it was very different depending on where you grew up. I felt kind of cheated. I really did. I had really, my mother was a wonderful storyteller, and she really made her Catholic childhood in Boston in a very active parish community sound like such a wonderful experience where their entire family life really revolved around this parish, the choir, the school, everything. And then suddenly I got to school and I thought, well, none of this is that, which is fascinating. But I think that the sort of counterbalance to that was I had an interesting perspective from both sides of Vatican II, which I've always really enjoyed as I've become an adult. And I would say, in addition to both my parents, my mother in particular, but the Sisters of Notre Dame had a tremendous impact on my childhood because, especially as you become an adult and you can really appreciate and look back, their standards were so high. They were very demanding educators. but they also, for me, were the women who, in addition to my mother, emulated what they were teaching about what obedience meant, what really serving your fellow Catholics and children and the elderly meant. And so for me, those women, in addition to the women in my family, probably had the biggest impact on my childhood.
Nancy grew up in a different part of the country.
Did. I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and spent my very early childhood there, but grew up in El Paso, Texas. And so a lot of my own religious upbringing was very much shaped by the border culture on the U.S.-Mexican border. And I remember being, I was raised very much as a Mexican-American Catholic, and that has enormous meaning for me. I think of certainly Boston being very Irish Catholic, as you're describing, and my own world of Catholicism was very Mexican-American. I'm the oldest of four, and one of my earliest experiences of faith, I remember when my mother was pregnant for the fourth time. I was 6 years old, and I had two brothers, so it was myself and then these two brothers, Paul and Philip. And I always remember getting into all kinds of fights with them, and being the oldest, you know, that gave me some authority over them, I thought. And that worked until I was probably about 8th grade. But anyway, at the age of 6, when my mother became pregnant for the fourth time, I prayed and prayed that, that this new baby would be a girl. And I remember just 3 days before my 7th birthday, my mother delivered Michelle. And I was just absolutely overcome because my sense of God was really shaped by that experience, because I thought God really answers prayers. And God, and that really had a huge impact on me as a child. And I grew up in a situation where we had a lot of theological dramas that were part of our own religious faith. My mother both my parents, very committed to the Catholic Church and to our parish. And so every Advent, my mother would organize in the neighborhood the Posadas, and which was a ritual reenactment of Mary and Joseph going from place to place, trying to find lodging for themselves so that Mary could have her child, could have Jesus. And so my mother would organize this with the neighbors. We'd go knock on doors and be denied lodging. And then eventually at the third house, we'd be welcomed in and we'd have this huge celebration. And that really shaped a lot of my religious imagination. That, and then we would act in these dramas during Lent. We would reenact the Passion of Jesus, especially during Holy Week. And so my sense of God was always very much connected into these stories that we were interpreting biblical stories, but doing so in a dramatic fashion. And so God was very much a part of our lives. And that gave me a sense of God being everywhere and just suffused through my experience. And that was very important in my own shaping and in my own upbringing.
Liz, as a 2005 graduate of Boston College, so we can all do the arithmetic. I remember pre-Vatican II. Liz does not.
So I was born and raised in a Catholic family and went to Catholic school from kindergarten through my master's. And I think one thing that really shaped me was actually when I first came to BC. So I came with that background, but I came to BC in 2001, which is right in the height of when everything exploded here, right across the street, really. And I remember that first Sunday that I was here. I lived over on the Newton campus, and I thought to myself, no one woke me up to go to Mass today. Am I going to go? Like, is this something that I'm going to choose to do, or is this something that my parents made me do? And so, you know, the day went on, and I still thought about it, but I hadn't gone yet and hadn't quite decided. And then some girls from my floor were all going just to Trinity Chapel right across the way. And so I decided, you know what, I'll go, which made my mother very happy and my brother, who was a seminarian at the time, very happy. But when I opened the door to Trinity Chapel, I can still see this image. I remember opening the door and seeing a community of peers that had something that I didn't have, but something that I knew I wanted. It was a bunch of peers that, to me anyway, owned their faith. And I thought to myself, that's not where I am right now, but that's something that I want to be able to say that I have. And so really through my whole journey at BC, one of the main things that I can walk away and say that I really gained here was being able to come to really embrace my faith as opposed to just accept a faith that I was brought up in, whether it was through conversations with friends or faculty, or through classes and books, through service projects and service trips and retreats. All these things helped to shape me to the point where I knew that faith was important to me. It was a part of who I was. It was who I was, and something that I wanted to continue to pursue. And I think it's significant that I was here during those times because so much was a struggle. In a sense, it would be so easy, not only starting college where you're making your own decisions about whether you're going to continue in your faith or not, but even just society, people seeing what they're saying about the Catholic faith and what the current situation was, and yet to be able to have these experiences here, to be able to grow from my background of my upbringing with my family, I think really was significant in a time where I was able to grow and really own my faith as those freshmen that I walked into the chapel and witnessed that day.
One of our themes here is that one can integrate one's Catholic faith and one's life and one's work. And I wonder, Liz, if you would talk a little bit about life after BC, where you've made some career choices and you've chosen to be a mother. How has your Catholic faith helped you make those choices? Has it influenced the choices? And how has it helped you implement the choices that you've made?
Absolutely. So I remember in between my sophomore and junior years, I went on a retreat here called the Halftime Retreat, and we spent the weekend really focusing on Father Michael Heim's 3 questions on vocation. And so the main questions were, what brings you joy? What are you good at? And what does the world need you to do? And so it just came for me at the perfect time, because ever since then, any major decision that I've made in life professionally, those 3 questions have been my companions. And so right after BC, I went on to do the ACE program, the Alliance for Catholic Education, through the University of Notre Dame. And those questions, I really prayed through those questions, and I found answers to all 3 of those questions through this service program. And so I was able to spend 2 years teaching down in Biloxi, Mississippi, and then in the summers was at Notre Dame earning my master's. And again, taking that foundation that my family gave me in faith, and then what I gained and learned here at BC, I was able to continue to grow in my faith through what Notre Dame had to offer, whether it be through the Congregation of the Holy Cross and their different aspects and focuses on the faith, but then also through the service and teaching these young children. But in terms of passions and how my Catholic faith has really continued throughout, even since that first step, I would say one of my main passions is service to Catholic schools. And I remember in my first in-service, when I was teaching that first year, we had a speaker come who was talking about the Catholic identity of the school. And she started out by saying, anyone who is a product of Catholic education, stand up. And so, not surprisingly, majority of the people in the room stood up because in one shape or form, they had been to Catholic schools. And she said, now, stay standing if you went to a Catholic elementary school. And so some sat down as they hadn't been in elementary school. Then she said, stay standing if you went to a Catholic high school. Again, some more sat down. And then finally she said, continue standing if you attended Catholic college or university. And at that point, I was the only one standing in the room. And maybe I'm just a visual person, but it took that moment for me to really realize what a gift I had received in my Catholic education and receiving that, and just how Catholic schools had formed who I was. And it was at that point that I realized this is something that I want to give back to. I had received so much from Catholic schools. I want to give back to that institution and also provide opportunities for others to be able to receive that same gift.
Nancy, did those stories from your childhood influence your choices?
Yes, they did. As a young woman in high school, I was taught by the Sisters of Loretto. We've been, as we know, of course, the women religious today, their work and so forth is being called under question again today. And so I'm just very grateful for the Sisters of Loretto and the way they formed and shaped me. And in high school, I remember going to Mass and watching the Mormons on their bikes go through the neighborhood and thinking, wow, you know, I should do that as a Catholic. And they were really quite a witness to me. So I went to Loyola Marymount, and while there, I made a silent retreat, and Father Randy Roush, who's there, really shaped and formed me in terms of spiritual direction, paying attention to my inner life. And out of all of that, and then the witness of the Mormons that I saw in my neighborhood, I decided, you know, I want to give a year of my life in service. And so as soon as I finished my undergraduate work, I decided to go to Palomas, Chihuahua, which is a border town, obviously on the Mexican side of the border, and spent a year there, and was involved with all kinds of people in the very significant times of their lives. I remember going to a Guadalupe service for the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe and watching these women who are cantineras walk into the room. And the cantineras are the women that work as prostitutes, basically, in downtown Palomas, and offering flowers to Guadalupe and thinking, wow, there's something here that is transformative on a larger level, because I wouldn't see that in my Catholic parish in the United States. And so that really caught my imagination. And then when I finished my year, I went back to El Paso and was working in business. I have an undergraduate degree in business administration, so I sold insurance for a period of time. And after about a year, I thought, this is really boring.
Apologies to any insurance salesmen in the audience.
I thought, I don't want to do this. I mean, Palomas was so much more engaging and exciting. So anyway, out of that experience, realizing I really want to be there with people in the times that are most important in their lives. And so from that, I moved to Seattle U and pursued a Master's of Divinity. But the coming together of my life story and paying attention to my inner life, as well as my experience out in the world, I think really shaped and formed me in terms of making a decision that ultimately has led me to Boston College, which is wonderful.
A theme is emerging here. Nancy and I work in a Catholic university. Liz works in Catholic education. Paula, you work in TV news.
I decidedly do not.
So this is a hard,
Right.
Is it a harder question for you?
My mother
How your
used
Catholic
to say,
faith?
bloom where you are planted. Yes, it's interesting, you know, listening to the similar experiences from 16 years of Catholic education. And I always remember, you know, growing up, really my parents lived by example very much. And then coming to Boston College, I was always very captivated by the Jesuit ideal of learning, growing to be a man or woman for others. That really your education is not in and of itself just for yourself in a selfish way for your own purposes, and that whatever you do, no matter where you are, it's your responsibility to live a Christ-like example. It's interesting because in my adult life after Boston College, I consider my two jobs. I'm raising 4 children, and my husband and I were, you know, 2 of those kids. We used to go to Mass here together. He was my RA, my dorm. We met right here. God, it was very scandalous. Got married not long after leaving BC and had 4 children in our 20s. And so I was a full-time stay-at-home mother for almost a decade, raising babies and toddlers and then getting them off to Catholic school at our parish school before I went back to work, which news journalism had always been my passion. And I knew I would do it someday, and it worked out. And I was fortunate enough, having grown up in this area where, you know, Boston's just a great news market, considering the universities, medicine, politics, sports, you name it. This is the best TV market in the country in which to work. And so lo and behold, I began at a cable news operation, then I went to New England Cable News. I get a call from the news director at WBZ who hires me, and my first assignment is to cover the sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. And I have to say, I have stood in front of the chancery doing live shots while you were an undergraduate. I have stood in front of parishes. I have had to stand on the sidewalk and interview, Patrick McSorley, who was a victim of a priest, and Mitchell Garabedian, the attorney representing hundreds of victims. And it was extremely painful, I have to say. You have to put all of that aside, obviously, as a professional. It hit me standing in front of the chancery back in 2002 that my great-grandfather, who had come here as a newspaperman to cover the Irish troubles for the local Irish Boston immigrants of the time in the late 1800s, had the incredible opportunity of his lifetime to travel to Rome for the installation of Cardinal O'Connell, who built this mansion so that the Irish Catholics of Boston could say, we have arrived. And 100 years later, I was standing in front of it as it fell down. And it was extremely important to me as a Catholic and a journalist that I had to be able to convey the pure journalism of what was happening. And as a Catholic, and so many of us, just because of the nature of this region, so many of us in news are Catholic, working alongside a lot of non-Catholics who really didn't understand that this is an institution that has to be held accountable. And I think that journalists really tried in those days and up until this point to cover it with fairness, to treat people with dignity, which was extremely important. But I would have my non-Catholic colleagues or friends, you're in the newsroom, you're discussing really horrid, painful episodes, and every once in a while one of them would say to me, how can you walk in one of those buildings? How do you do that after what you know and what you're doing? And I would say to them, you just don't have the memories I have of hundreds of magnificent men and women that I experienced growing up. And the only thing I can compare it to them was that Americans did not renounce their American citizenship after Watergate. There was a responsibility to acknowledge problems where they existed, hold the institution accountable, but move on, because that's your responsibility as a citizen of that institution. And so covering the Catholic Church in the Boston area, while there are great days at Boston College or with Cardinal O'Malley, there are tough days too. And just in news in general, non-Catholic Church news, I think it is important. I saw my father as a surgeon and physician always treat people with such dignity because he was such a devout Catholic and really care for them. And so very often when you're a reporter, you're with people at the very worst moment of their life. And so I think just remembering to treat people with dignity has been the most important thing for my Catholic education in terms of news.
Thank you. Paula's story about the sexual abuse crisis reminds me that we are living in the American Catholic Church of 2012. For good or ill, we're living in the American Catholic Church of 2012. Nancy, as you think about the future, what gives you hope for the American Catholic Church?
Yes, it's very interesting to listen to Paula talk about standing outside at the Chancery here in Boston and covering this news story, because I worked for many years inside a Chancery. I worked in Seattle for 6 years for both Archbishop Hunhausen and Archbishop Murphy, and I knew them both very, very well. And Archbishop Hunhausen, thankfully, is still with us now, fishing as an elderly man in Montana. But when you ask me what gives me hope, well, there's a number of things that give me hope, but certainly my experience of the church in Seattle was one of those, because he was somebody who, Archbishop Hunhausen in particular, was a leader in Seattle who, for Good Friday, he would be out at the Bangor submarine base talking about how Bangor was the Auschwitz, he called it the Auschwitz of Puget Sound, which you can imagine picked up all kinds of press in Seattle, which it did. And he talked about just the horrific tragedy that nuclear armaments could bring to the world and how Catholics had to stand against that. And for me, as someone in their 20s witnessing an archbishop do this in a very public way, being covered by the press very publicly, gave me a lot of hope. And he believed very much that women should be in very prominent positions in the church. And I had, as a result of that, a very significant position, as well as other women in Seattle. And so that gives me hope even to this day, to live in the memory of what I knew of the church in Seattle in those years. And I think I also gain a lot of hope from my students here at the School of Theology and Ministry. Absolutely. It's amazing to me that I have students who are in their 20s and 30s, knowing the sacrifices they have to make personally and economically to be in the school, particularly lay women and lay men, especially them. I think that gives me enormous hope, because I look at how they must see much of what's gone on in the church in the last few years, in the last decade, especially around the sexual abuse crisis, and yet they still feel and are aware of the richness of this tradition and are willing to put their lives forward and to risk everything really to be able to pursue of service in the church and ministry in the church. And I find that extremely, extremely hopeful.
Thanks. Liz, what gives you hope?
Well, when I first started teaching down in Mississippi after I graduated from BC, we had 1 week of in-service in the first week of August, and we had 3 full weeks of school, and then Hurricane Katrina hit. And I was teaching right on the Gulf of Mexico, and so everything was just destroyed. And yet, despite all the suffering and all the devastation that was going on where we were, the way the people, the community came together in their faith was such a sign of hope for me. So similar as you're saying from a past experience and bringing that forward and keeping that memory alive within me, as you were mentioning just about seeing the church as the people of God, to see how everyone worked together as community, and that faith that was so life-giving at such a tough time. That is what gives me hope. So despite any challenges that we have as a church, to be able to think about when we come together in faith, the hope that arises as a result of that common faith, that really brings me forward in my beliefs.
Paula, you've seen a great deal of the harder side of this.
Yeah.
What gives you hope as you think about the future?
We're very involved in a lot of Catholic schools, as you are. My daughters attend Newton Country Day School of the Sacred Heart, and in our parish school, St. John's. I do think that it's interesting, going back to the memory of that Baltimore Catechism, and sort of, I don't see in young people that I'm with a lot these days, the focus isn't rules and regulations. It's really active service. And I think that that's very hopeful. It's very important to this generation, the generation of students now who are in high school and college. And I think that's very hopeful that, and I keep going back to them because I can't help it, but my parents were like that. They sort of felt as though you had to really live it. It really was not enough to talk about it. And I think that this generation of children definitely feels that. Mm-hmm.
For myself, I'm a church historian, so I can say truthfully that in the 2,000 years of the history of Christianity, there have been worse times.
Yeah.
And we got through them.
No burnings at the stake recently.
Not recently, but one never knows. We've gotten through those bad times, and we will get through this one as well.